Whew, I need a breather after that one.
There's a few more verses in that song.
Yes, there are. Ezra chapter 5. Ezra chapter 5. If you remember, on Wednesday, in chapter 4, they had in chapter 3, they had laid the foundation of the temple. They had then eventually finished the temple. They began working on rebuilding the walls of the city. And we get into chapter 4, and obviously some of the folks around were becoming a little uncomfortable with the reestablishment of the city. And so they pitched a presentation to help with the rebuilding. And they were politely denied that opportunity, which they didn't like. So they wrote a letter. They sent a letter to King Artaxerxes, who at the time was the Persian king, and told him that these were rebellious people and everything they were doing, and so they were, obviously their intent was to get him to stop the building that was going on. And they were successful. The work ceased, and you can imagine the discouragement that probably came with that. And so when you finish chapter 4 and verse 24, it says that the work of the house of God ceased at Jerusalem, and it ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, who is now the king of Persia. So we have gone through, there's been another transition in who is king of the Persians. We have seen, does anybody remember who it started with? Persian king. Who was the Persian king that told them to go back? Cyrus. Then we had a transition from Cyrus to Cyrus let him go. Cyrus sent him back. Ahasuerus. And then after Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes. And then after Artaxerxes, Darius. And so that's where we are now. So now mind you, Artaxerxes is the one that sent word back and told them to go up and kindly let them know to stop. And they did. So now again, this is, mind you, Darius is not the one that initially stopped the work. But he is king now. Work is still ceased. He's been king for 2 years. We get to chapter 5 and we begin in verse number 1. In this chapter, really, we begin to kind of bring in, some other books of the Bible, particularly some books of the prophets, such as Haggai and Zechariah. And so here in verse number 1 says, Then the prophets, Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophesied unto the Jews that were in Judah and in Jerusalem in the name of God, in the name of the God of Israel, even unto them. Then rose up Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, the son of Jozadak, and began to build the house, and with them that were the prophets of God helping them. The word of Haggai, the words of the prophet Haggai, to this community of returned exiles, we obviously find penned in the book named after Haggai. And the heart of his prophecy is really found in Haggai chapter 1 and verses 2 through 10. And so the two prophets who claim their message in Jerusalem, they arrive on the scene at a time of deep depression. This was not, they were not brought in during a time of great revival, or, they were not brought in to as spokesmen to give it utterance. But in Haggai chapter 1, verses 2 through 10, we see that the prophet Haggai rebuked the people for their attitude. What was their attitude? Let's turn over to Haggai if you would. They were slothful. Yeah. What was it that they said? Does anybody remember?
The time is not right.
Yeah, they said time's not right. If I had known I was going to turn there, I would have marked it in my Bible so I could have beat y'all there. I don't know. There he is. All right. Just go to Zechariah. He's got a little more to say, I guess, than Haggai did. But if you look at, let's read verses 2 through 10. It says, "Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, The time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. Then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lying waste? Now therefore, thus saith the Lord, consider your own and bring in. You eat, but you have not enough. You drink, but you are not filled with drink. You clothe you, but there is none warm. And he that earneth wages to put it into a bag with holes. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the mountain, bring wood, bring the house, and build the house, and I will take pleasure in it, and I will be glorified, saith the Lord. Ye looked for much, and lo, it came to little. And when you brought it home, I did blow upon it. Why? Saith the Lord of hosts, because of mine house that is waste, and you run every man unto his own house. Therefore the heaven over you is stayed from dew, and the earth is stayed from her fruit. So Haggai rebukes them because they have kind of just gotten slothful. They've kind of had a haphazard attitude towards the work. And, he tells them that the time is, you say that the time has not come that the Lord's house should be built. And so in other words, the people are making excuses, right? They could speak against the idea of building, so they couldn't speak against it because they could. Really, they could have kept building. Yes, they had received word to stop, but they could have continued. So what do they, and they had all the resources. So what do they say? The timing's not right. It's just not the right time. And, and so he rebukes them with very pointed words. In fact, he tells them, he says, you yourself dwell in paneled houses, and yet this lies in ruins. The problem is simply wrongly ordered priorities. They were content to let that suffer at the expense of their own comfort. Instead, they should have felt no rest until the work of God was as prosperous as their own personal lives, and had been as willing to sacrifice the work for the work of God as they were for their own personal luxury. And so God spoke to them through Haggai, told them to consider their ways, and that they needed to go up in the mountains and bring wood to finish building, and that God would take pleasure in it and be glorified. And God called them to do what? It's that four-letter word that is an ugly word, work. He called it work. Sometimes God's cause needs work. Work that is supported by prayer, not work that because of service. These people had allowed a delay beyond their control to become a delay of their own choosing. Sure, they couldn't control what the king said, right? They had absolutely no control over it. They had begun this work. They had begun doing what they were there to do, even from Cyrus. And so they could have went to God and said, God, we want to continue doing this. We want to finish building the city. We want to finish everything that we want Jerusalem to be reestablished. But what did they do? They had a little bit of opposition and they quit. No longer, based on Haggai's response to them, the work of God had just completely been put aside. It was not of priority. It was not of significance to them. And so, so Haggai comes and provides a rebuke over their attitude toward building. But then you have Zechariah recorded for us in the book of Zechariah. And so Haggai's prophecy more a direct encouragement to get busy with the work of rebuilding. But Zechariah, his prophecy is mostly directed towards what? Anybody know what Zechariah's prophecy was directed towards? Zechariah's prophecy was more directed towards their spiritual condition. So you have one that is directed more towards the rebuilding and their attitude towards that. But the other, Zechariah, that was Haggai, Zechariah is addressing their spiritual condition. Exactly, their evil doings. The name Zechariah means the Lord remembers, and really is a fitting for a prophet delivering a message of restoration. Zechariah was encouraged and he was called and encouraged and mobilized to mobilize God's people and accomplish the task that they began. However, they've lost momentum, haven't they? They come in, listen, this group, man, they came back and they hit the ground running. They were all in. They were going to do this thing. They began, but then you have opposition. They just kind of quit. They lose momentum in finishing what they started. And so Zechariah encouraged them indirectly by telling them and reminding them about God's care for them and by keeping the presence of the Messiah very much in their minds. And, Zechariah worked with others. Notably, he worked with Haggai. He worked with Zerubbabel. He worked with Ezra. And he warned them of the consequences of neglecting God's work. And he emphasized that God wanted to do a work through his people. Can I tell you, nothing has changed today. God still desires to do a work through his people. We go through periods of time where we get a little bit of resistance. And it's not even anybody coming in and telling us, you can't do that. It may just be a little bit of just difficult work, right? Yeah. 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 Absolutely. I mean, it's how it is. And some, you're absolutely right. You go back to on fire for the Lord. And they get out. A little bit of opposition or a little bit of resistance. And some of those people never came back. And honestly, and it's not here. I promise you, I talked to pastors today that they still have not recovered in the slightest from COVID. Listen, I hear stories all the time, and I think, man, we had some that didn't come back, but we had some that never stopped. That's right. So they had kind of taken a little bit. They had gotten slothful. They had gotten just taken a haphazard attitude, and they'd lost momentum. And so he encouraged them indirectly by again reminding them that God is there for them. God is going to care for you. God is going to provide for you. God is going to protect you. And so not only did he remind them that, but he also warns them. Zechariah does. He warns them that, hey, guess what? Because God is going to provide, because God is going to take care of you, because he's going to make sure that you are successful in doing what he has called you to do, if you choose not to do it, guess what comes with that? Consequences. It brings consequences. If you choose not to do God's work, then there's consequences of neglecting it. And I look at this, and this is just a little piece, and you do have to go and you have to look at Haggai's account, and you have to go and look at Zechariah's account in addition to what is said here in Ezra. But if all we had was Haggai's account, where he rebukes them over the lack of building, we might be tempted to think that all God was really interested in was the rebuilding of Jerusalem. But Zechariah gives the rest of the story, don't he? And shows that God is it's more about the lives than it is the building. Here we also see, I love this, whenever you get to the latter part of verse, or really just verse number 2. It says, then rose up Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Joshua the son of Jozadak, and began to build the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, with them the prophets of God helping them. I love that phrase, the prophets of God were helping them. The work of these prophets was effective. It helped the people properly reorder their priorities. It helped them to resume the building work in Jerusalem. But this verse also indicates that their work went beyond the directly prophetic. This tells us that they were involved in the physical labor as well. They take a hand in helping with the practical work of building. And I say that because there should not be anybody, I don't care if it's pastor, I don't care who it is, there should not be anybody that feels like they are above getting their hands involved in the Lord's Word. All of us should be. These are prophets that God used, but they were still involved in the work. They were not doing, I strive to make sure that I will never ask anybody to do anything that I'm not willing to do myself. I don't think that I think that's how it should be. And so we see that here, kind of looking back and reflecting here on Darius, as Darius is king. Understand that when you look through history, Darius came to the throne following Artaxerxes during a time of conflict and struggle. And so, they're still going through that. Darius is still dealing with that conflict and struggle at the time that they begin the rebuilding of Jerusalem here. And so, the Jews, they started their work. Did they have permission from Darius to start this rebuilding? Why? They did this because without permission, Darius is too busy fighting for his throne to attend to the trouble of a small distant city. Look at verses 3 through 5. At the same time came to them Tatnai, governor, on this side of the river, and Shethar-bozenai and their companions, and said thus unto them, Who hath commanded you to build this house and to make up this wall? Then said we unto them after this manner, What are the names of the men that make this building? But the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, that they could not cause them to cease, till the matter came to Darius. And then they returned answered by letter concerning this matter. So they're rebuilding, they're on the job site, and all of a sudden Tatnai comes up, who is the governor on this side of the river. So remember when they came back from exile, they had to cross over. And so no doubt the Persians had appointed somebody over in that land that would kind of govern things, because Darius couldn't be everywhere. And so he was kind of Darius's watchdog, if you will. And so he comes in and he asks them the question, who gave you permission to begin rebuilding again? Who told you that you could do this? Now, it's not written anywhere. It's not provided for us in Scripture, at least. But do you think these guys just happened to stumble upon this? I don't think so. I believe those same Samaritan folks that had sent Artaxerxes his letter probably reached out to Tatnai and said, hey, you know, these folks here were told to stop, and they're rebuilding. You have to imagine that the group of returned exiles, of Jews, probably outnumbered those Samaritans. Probably by this point they're a little better equipped to defend themselves against such a group. So they're probably not comfortable just walking in and telling them to stop as they had previously. But anyway, so Tatnai comes in and asks them this question, and he says, you know, who commanded you to build this and make this wall? And so, you know, I love it, says, then said we unto them after this manner, what are the names of the men that make this building? And then this is the greatest part. But the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, that they could not cause them to cease. Now this governor could have said, stop. You don't have permission. But who's working here? God's working. God worked in a way that they could not. I mean, I don't know how you read that, but it says that they could not cause them to cease. And to me, God is working in a way in this situation that says, you know what, it don't matter if they wanted to, they can't. Now, don't forget, there's been changing of power and changing of kings. And so, what does Tatnai really know? What's he really familiar with? Does he know the history here? Or is he just, like I said, has he been tattled to by the Samaritans and coming in? So, God is working here to protect the work and allowing it to continue. Again, Tatnai is probably a man that was appointed by the king of Persia to govern this area that included Judea. But like every spiritual advance, you can go all the way back from Abraham's to the missionary expansion in Asia. This venture began. Who commanded them to get back to work? They didn't have a command from Darius, but somebody commanded them to get back to work. That's right. This started with a a word from the Lord, and because this started with a word from the Lord, there wasn't nobody going to stop it. However, at the same time, while this began with a word from the Lord, just as in common with, again, going back to Abraham's and the missionary expansion, listen, it's going to be quickly tested and threatened. When God is working and God gives a word and God says, I want you to do this, be prepared. Because Satan is going to try to prevent it from ever happening. If he can get the Lord's work to stop, he's going to get the Lord's work to stop. And so, Tatnai seems much more reasonable than what they've encountered previously. As far as his opposed work, they had been opposed some 15 years prior to this by those Samaritans. Which, by the way, this shows us something. When the Samaritans came in, do you remember what was the first thing they wanted to do? They wanted to join the Word. They were denied that. So we know that their whole basis started with an evil pretense. They had their whole reason was to just shut it down. But what we see here is while there's still opposition from Tatnai, at least coming in and questioning it, he hasn't told them to stop because he can't tell them to stop. I think this shows us that not all who oppose God's work do it out of premeditated evil. The Samaritans, absolutely. I'm not so sure that that's the case here because I believe that Tatnai is doing what he's doing out of a custom and sense of duty. And so in verse 4 it says, Then we said unto him after this manner, What are the names of the men that make this building? I think this is recorded, I would guess, to demonstrate that there's no hint of rebellion. Accordingly, we told them the names. When you look at that, they told them, and it's written in a question, but they actually said, here's the men that are rebuilding this temple. Here's the men that are rebuilding this city. They give them the names of those men. They wanted to know the names, undoubtedly. And so they've given them the names. And this is just to show, I think, personally, that this is to show they're not doing this in a rebellious nature. Don't forget, they were sent there by Cyrus. They were not rebuilding this in a manner in which they were going to try to overthrow any government anywhere. And so they're being transparent. And again, no way are they trying to rebel against the Persian king. So I think they wanted to know the names of the men that make up the building. I believe they gave them the names of the men that were working and leading this adventure as a way of showing that there's no rebellion here. And I know that whenever you look at the question there, it really throws that off. But I think when you look at it in the greater sense, I think that's what they were doing, was explaining themselves that, hey, we're not here, there's no rebellion here. We're being transparent. Maybe that helps, maybe it doesn't, maybe it creates more confusion. So Tatnai could not cause them to cease at this moment. In the present time, in their presence, he could not cause them to cease. But look what it says, till the manner came to Darius. And so they wanted to hear what the king had to say. What's the king going to say regarding this? There's two good reasons, for this. First is the nature of bureaucracy, right? Tat and I couldn't go down to the post office and pay to have this letter overnighted. Right? It wouldn't have got there anyhow. Just I have to stand up for the postal service now. If you pay the money, the big money, because it costs a lot to overnight something, it gets there, and it gets back. I can vouch for that. But if you just send it normal mail, don't expect anything extra for it or out of it, because you. So this means that because, again, it's a long journey, and it wasn't going to be put on an airplane in Jerusalem and flown to Persia. It was going to have to be carried by somebody, either by foot or on the back of a donkey, Brother Carl. And so this means that the work was going to be able to continue for some time. About 7 months. Second reason this is good, because they could, listen, they know who's going to give the response to the letter. So you know what that means? That means they know how to pray. They know how to pray. They know to pray and ask God to work on Darius's heart for a favorable response. Listen, when just little details, when we know them, it can change things like that. And so they knew how to pray, and they could trust that God would guide Darius to that favorable decision. And so then we get to verse number 6. The copy of the letter that Tatnai, governor on this side of the river, and Shethar-boznai, and his companions, the Apharsactites, which were on this side of the river, sent unto Darius the king. And then so this is the letter, verses 7 through 17, that they're going to send. They sent the letter unto him, wherein was written thus. This is what it said. Unto Darius the king, all peace. Be it known unto the king that we went into the province of Judea to the house of the great God, which is built with great stones, and timber is laid in the walls. And this work goeth fast on, and prospereth in their hands. Then asked we those elders, and said unto them thus, Who commanded you to build this house and to make up these walls? We asked their names also to certify thee, that we might write the names of the men that were the chief of them. And thus they returned answer, saying, We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and build the house that was builded these many years ago, which the great kings of Israel builded and set up. But after that our fathers had provoked the God of heaven unto wrath. He gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried the people away into Babylon. But in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Babylon, the same king Cyrus made a decree to build this house of God. And the vessels also of gold and silver of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that was in Jerusalem and brought them into the temple of Babylon, those did Cyrus the king take out of them the temple of Babylon, and they were delivered unto one, whose name was Shebazar, which I believe is Nebuchadnezzar, whom he had made governor. And said unto him, Take these vessels, go, carry them into the temple that is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be builded in this place. Then came the same Sheshbazzar, and laid the foundation of the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. And since that time, even until now, hath it been in building, and yet it is not finished. Now therefore, if it seem good to the king, let there be search made in the king's treasure house, which is there at Babylon, whether it be so, that a decree was made of Cyrus the king to build this house of God at Jerusalem. Let the king send his pleasure to us concerning this matter. So I think you see a little bit of that answer there where he said, we asked the names of the ones that were in charge, and they gave us the names. When you read this letter, does it sound anything like what you would expect it to have said?
It's very complimentary.
It's very complimentary. It's very accurate. There is no, one of the things whenever I read that letter, is that there is no reference to Artaxerxes. And did Artaxerxes tell them to stop? The only thing that's recorded in that letter is can you check into it and see if Cyrus sent them to rebuild this? Because you know what's going to happen whenever they go through the records. They're going to find where Cyrus did exactly what they said he sent them to do. When you look at it, listen, the walls they were rebuilding, the fact that, it's referenced that they're being built with heavy stones. I'm sure there's maybe some question there as to whether or not they're building a fortress or what they're really building. Nonetheless, it's a spectacle. And it brought attention. But I look at this and when you go back and you see how easily the people gave up. And then God reached out through Haggai and through Zechariah and said, y'all got to get it together. You've just kind of taken a haphazard approach. You've let God's work suffer while you tend to your own needs. You tend to everything you want. You make sure you've got the best of the best. But meanwhile, everything here is just going to ruins. And he warned them of the consequences of not being obedient to the commands of God. And yet when they were obedient, how did God respond? So far, he's taken good care of them, hasn't he? Again, Tatnai could have come in and tried to shut it down right there. But he didn't. Why? I believe because God intervened. I believe God worked in the affairs of men just like he always does and always has and always will to make sure that his will is accomplished. Sometimes we are much like these people and we get sidetracked. We get inwardly focused. And we lose sight of the fact there's work to be done. Amen? And we have to understand that just like them, if we are not doing the work we've been called to do, there's consequences that come with that. We also have to understand no matter what kind of opposition comes our way, that we're to remain faithful. And we're to keep doing whatever it is God's called us to do. Amen? Anybody have any thoughts, comments, or questions tonight?